All right, welcome to our next topic in STEM 118. We're talking about culture. We were clearly leading up to this idea as we finished up ancestry in last week's video and the DNA testing kits, right? How much can they really tell you? And it led to this idea that I can identify some of my ancestry, the people who I came from, but what does that mean? Who are those people? What is it about sharing their DNA? Is that important to me or not? And it brought this idea of identifying those ancestors into a specific group, a culture. And we're going to see here, as we kind of start to think about what is culture, these definitions are pretty broad. Customs, social interactions, beliefs, values, knowledge, these are words I'm pulling off this slide, right? I think it's interesting the fact that they are transmitted and reinforced by members of the group. What that also means is anytime you have a transmission with a chance of change, you have a chance for evolution, right? So just like when we think about DNA incurring mutations and being passed off with diversity into the next generation, then that among that diversity, what moves forward is the most appropriate to the environment. When you have cultural components, whether those beliefs, ideas, whatever, if they change, or as they change even slightly as they're passed up to the next generation, what's taken, it evolves, it changes over time, right? And to greater or lesser extents depending on many, many factors. But as we explore that culture, I think it's an interesting question as we think about the biology of it, is there a human culture? Are there aspects of every culture that have to be there because they're a human culture, right? So what you're really asking is there some genetic component to culture? All right. So there's a couple books. Well, there's one book out there that I know is called Universals, and it attempts to kind of categorize all the things that are universal to human beings and their lifestyles. And it's controversial as to what really merits being admitted to that list of a truly universal. But if you just search the web, you can find some interesting things. This is one particular list of the top 10 from Psychology Today. And it's interesting to kind of read through. So these are again are pretty general, and not all of them are great eye openers. Some of them you're like, well, of course. But number 10, across populations, infants cry to communicate basic needs. And again, that seems to be pretty cultural. I'm sorry, pretty genetic, non-cultural, because you would think that a newborn baby hasn't had a time to acquire any culture, right? So they're responding basically on pure instinct, right? What is pre-programmed? That makes sense. Emotional expressions that signal happiness, joy, surprise, anger are recognizable and constant in all human populations, right? So they're saying is regardless of what language that you speak, you are probably pretty good if you're human at telling when someone's angry at you or surprised or happy, right? So that seems to be universal. And that, again, it doesn't go too far out on a limb to consider the genetic components of that. Humans form groups based on qualities that cut across kinship lines, such as shared religion, political affiliation, tribe, or favorite sports team. And as we get into this topic a little bit more, we'll talk about this idea of in-group versus out-group and how incredibly arbitrary a group can form, right? And how powerful that is, right? There have been a lot of studies showing that just arbitrarily putting people into groups based on random numbers leads to in-group, out-group bias, right? It's weird, but it's how our brains are built. And so again, that goes back to kind of the biology that we have a tendency to kind of collect ourselves into groups, and that is going to be probably pretty useful as a survival mechanism, at least in the environments that we evolved in. Number 7, while details vary from group to group, human groups have specific traditions regarding such events as marriage, birth of a child, or death of a loved one. So significant life events, there is some ritual or tradition associated with that. And that seems to be fairly universal. Music is a truly human universal, right? That's cool. And so it makes you wonder about the genetic component of music, right? Like that's a whole topic. People dislike and are often afraid of stimuli that have threatened the safety of our ancestors, parasitic insects, venomous snakes. And again, there's a good amount of literature out there. I haven't delved into the primary literature on this, but there are some things that are instinctively triggering. People dislike, oh, we got that one. Kinship matters. and affects social organization in all human groups that have ever been studied. And so again, it goes back to this idea that we've established consistently over the quarter that we are social animals, right? That as an animal, we have evolved to survive as a group, right? And that seems, again, not a huge surprise. Humans everywhere have the capacity to learn language. The idea of the complex language is, in fact, one of the hallmarks of humanity. So our species is one of the few on the planet that can develop a language as complex as we have. It's the only one, right? So yes, some chimpanzees, you can teach some chimpanzees some sign language, right? And obviously you can teach birds, some birds to mimic, to speak, right? A short vocabulary, but the syntax and the complexity of a true language, we've never seen anywhere else except in us. And so all humans seem to have that capability. Humans across the globe demonstrate a strong need for connection with other humans. I think this is almost a reiteration of the fact that we're a social animal. And then finally, people everywhere have the capacity for laughter and joy. And that's a really weird one. It's cool if you really think about it, because in most animals, like a display of your teeth and your weapons when you laugh, is aggressive. But it's the opposite. When we smile and show teeth, it's like, hey, I'm welcoming you. That makes me happy. I accept you. When in fact, in many cases in the animal kingdom, that is it's time for you to back off. So that's kind of cool about humans. But again, the idea here is that if there is something that is common to all people, is there a genetic component to that, going back to nurture versus nature? Now, clearly, cultures have a significant portion of nurture in there, right? These are, again, the traditions, the knowledge, the rituals that are handed down to you as knowledge from the previous generation, right? So if my ancestors were members, so that's supposed to be if my ancestors were members of an identified culture, right, like we said, we found out that I'm pretty Finnish, right? Like half of my DNA is from my mom, and that's all Finnish, right? They're standard group, right? So what does that mean to me, right? So that's the question. So this lecture shouldn't be too long, but it's going to have a lot of questions in it that I want you to think about, so you can come to class and then we can have discussions. We already were kind of getting ramped up onto some really good discussion there last week on this topic, so it certainly is a good one. What does it mean to me, right? Does it mean something that my mom speaks another language and grew up in a household that spoke that other language and cooked food that I don't eat and did things that I don't do? Like, what is that? Does that give me claim to those activities? Does the fact that I'm Finnish exclude me from activities from other cultures that I don't have a blood or a DNA relation to? So the next question that I want you to think about is this: in what cultures or groups do you claim membership? And again, this goes beyond this idea of nationality or ethnicity, because again, we have this natural tendency to group very readily. So, what are you? A jock? Are you a gamer? Are you a reader? Are you a poet? Whatever. Like, we all form these groups. So think about all the different groups that you claim membership to, right? And then what constitutes acceptance as a member, right? So I can claim membership to any group, but does that group accept me as a member is going to have a pretty big impact on how I embrace that culture, right? What advantages come with any given membership, right? So clearly, again, based on what we've talked about all quarter long, I present very clearly as a white male in America, having to be heterosexual, right? So there's definitely some advantages based on our white supremacist culture, society in America that I get for that, right? What are disadvantages that come with your membership, right? So the whole point of me claiming myself as a racist individual is not the choice that I make, but is the fact that the advantages that I gain from all those criteria I just listed is at the cost of groups that aren't mine, right? So the out groups are suffering for my advantages, if you're not a white heterosexual male, there may be some disadvantages you're incurring, right? And if you are, they're probably pretty obvious to you. If you're not, you have privilege from your, think about your advantages. Are those advantages at the cost of other groups, right? Social justice. Now, what I do want to present here is some pretty significant psychological studies on some of those, one aspect of those disadvantages. And so this is a great book that Claude Steele wrote called Whistling Vivaldi. It's really worth the read. He's a social psychologist out of Stanford. And I believe a couple years ago he came to talk at, he came and gave a talk at South Seattle College, which was, I unfortunately wasn't able to make it. But he kind of came up with the idea and coined the phrase stereotype threat, right? So a situational predicament in which people are or feel themselves to be at risk of conforming to stereotypes about their social group, right? So it's interesting because, and I don't want to harp on too many of those stereotypes, but quote unquote good stereotypes and bad stereotypes can both be deleterious when you as an individual are feeling pressure to conform to that stereotype, right? So when a stereotype is in place, a person's performance can be measurably diminished because of this psychological phenomenon. So when you are taking a test or in an interview, basically the idea is that you will not be at your prime because of the stereotype threat, right? Because you're afraid of conforming or being called out as evidence for support of that stereotype, right? So what are the mechanisms going on in stereotype threat, right? The impact is greatest when people are working at their upper limits of a task, right? So now let me give you an example. So some of the examples from the book, and this is how they did the tests, where they played into common American stereotypes, one being that women aren't as good at math and engineering and science, right? And so what they did was they basically took women and men who, based on their performance scholastically and other tests, were very good at math, right? And they set up a situation then where they reminded either very obviously or subtly that the women, women in America aren't really as good at math as men are. Okay, now take this test. And could see immediately a drop in the scores, right? Something as simple as a phrase like that can have an impact that is measurable on their performance, okay? Why? How does that happen? Stress, right? So literally physiological stress, performance monitoring, narrowing of attention. So now what I'm going to do is be like, I am trying to look at what I'm doing so carefully because I want to make sure that I do the best that I can on this because I don't want to promote that stereotype that women aren't as good at math if I'm a woman taking this math test. But you know what? That eats up some of my bandwidth, my energy. Then I got to suppress the negative thoughts and emotions. It's like, oh yeah, am I good enough? Is it true? Are women really worse at math? And maybe that's true. Maybe I'm not getting this right. Maybe I'm struggling with this because of that. And none of that is true. It's not true. It is a false stereotype, but it has a clear impact through this mechanism. So the idea is that, again, people have only so much bandwidth, and that when that stereotype is prevalent, or you're reminded of it, these factors divert from your task at hand. So these come out most demonstrably when you're kind of at your upper limit, when you don't have any extra bandwidth left, right? That's when we see it. But you know what? Those are the situations where we really differentiate and make decisions about jobs or admission scores or promotions, right? So it's a real thing. So how can we work against stereotype threat? Well, there's a classic book that's it's good. It's been big in education and all kinds of things. Is this idea of mindset? One that intellectual ability is incremental, not innate. So some people are like, well, I'm just one of those people who's just not good at math, or I'm just not very smart. And that's really to a great extent a bunch of hooey. Intellectual ability comes from practice. We have the same physiology in our brain, right? When I practice things, when I work through mechanisms to learn, I change my brain. And that's true for everybody. So this idea of learning and intellectual ability as an iterative process is true, and that I can get better is a mindset that everyone should have, but not everyone does. And when you don't have that mindset that like, oh, I'm just dumb or I'm not good at this, it locks you in, right? And you don't get better, okay? It has an impact. Self-affirmation, right? So you want to remind yourself that you can do this, that you are capable, that mindset matters. Social belonging to associated disciplines groups. So if you're a member of some math society or whatever, you're like, oh yeah, I can do math. It bolsters kind of those internal mechanisms. Environments that are not dominated by the majority's identity, right? So again, let's go back to the example of a woman taking a math test for admissions or maybe an engineering job or what have you, and she's the only woman in the room surrounded by a bunch of men. That unconsciously certainly is going to reinforce a stereotype, right? Representation of marginal groups in success leadership roles, i.e. teachers. One of the biggest impacts that they've seen on the success of young African-American men is having an African-American man as a teacher somewhere in their educational career, right? And that's it, right? Just having that authority figure that looks like you has a huge impact on your success. And then priming individualism. That the idea that, you know, you do kind of relegate yourself to groups, but you are not your group, right? And again, this is hard sometimes. We see it all the time with white people asking the minority or marginalized person in the room to speak for their entire group. It's like, they can't, they don't represent all of their group. Like, they're their own person, right? And so remembering that as an individual when you face that stereotype threat, that you are not the stereotype, you are an individual, is going to be really important. And that's going to be kind of the theme as we move forward in this idea of cultural clashes, right? So the next thing we want to, kind of questions I want to put out there for you to think about is the idea of what experience do you have with cultural appropriation? So of the groups that you do belong to or that you claim membership of, have other groups taken your culture, right? What is considered appropriation? And who owns what? Right? Those are big questions. And so I think this could be fruitful discussion. So I do want you to kind of do a little bit of thinking about that, and we'll talk about that in class for sure. Now, there's a great book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, by Yuval Harari. He's written a couple other books. Sapiens is one. But in this one in particular, he talks about kind of cultural clashes, right? And he gives this example of Coldia versus Warm Land. And these are two different cultures, and how, when those two cultures interact, how it affects people's performance and promotions in a business setting. So I have posted on the website the excerpt. It's just one page where he kind of walks through this example of how these two cultures can clash. And so I want you to take a couple minutes, stop the video, go read that, and then think about it. Think about what your response is to that. So pause, do that, and then come back. Welcome back. Yuval's response, I think, is really interesting. And you can read through this, but ultimately, he's saying that when you have this clash of culture, while culture is important, people are also shaped by their genes and their unique personal histories, right? Individuals often defy statistical stereotypes. It makes sense for a firm to prefer social employees to stony ones, but it does not make sense for them to prefer warmlanders to coldians. I.e., it goes back to some of the themes that we talked about very early in the quarter, statistical versus categorical. We talked about this with regard to gender. We even talked about this with regard to sex. Like, just because statistically speaking, you know, you can say this about a group, it doesn't mean anything about an individual, right? And oftentimes, again, the statistical average, the mean, doesn't even exist, right? You can have 100 people, and none of them are the perfect average. Everyone's unique in that respect, and so you have to approach them in that way. Now, when you think about culture and think about the different cultures that you belong to, and one of the things that obviously we need to emphasize is the importance of learning about different cultures and celebrating the differences between cultures. But the other question I think that is important to address is are there cultures or aspects of certain cultures that are objectively bad? that we, whoever we are, can point to you and say, I realize that's part of your culture, but it's not right. Looking through the lens of our own culture, because it's impossible not to look through the lens of your own culture, or is it? So think about that, and then we can definitely talk about that more in class as well. All right, so I hope this is a good primer for fruitful discussion. Take care, stay safe, and we'll talk to you real soon.